Hello and welcome back to Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, April 26th. Also a great pleasure to welcome back to Press Pass Greg Sukiennik, who is the political reporter and writer for the Bennington Banner, Brattleboro Reformer, and last but not least, the Manchester Journal. And he covers Vermont government and politics for those papers. Greg, great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for making the time for this.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's great to see you again.
And our timing, of course, is fortuitous, for a couple of reasons. But first of all, kudos are in order for the first place award you won for editorial writing from the New England Newspaper and Press Association. That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Not writing editorials too much these days, but it's good to be recognized, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, you're more than welcome. Your writing is always interesting, and I always read them. I have to keep up the speed, it comes with the territory or something like that. But anyway, the timing is also fortuitous because you follow the state legislature very closely, and they are now sort of working their way towards the end of the first year of this biennium, I guess. Usually sometime in May, they call it an adjournment for at least 1 year, although you never know. Stranger things have happened, right? But I just thought we could start off our conversation today by having you tell us a little bit about what's going on with the state budget, the big bill as it's sometimes referred to, because there's a lot of moving parts seeming, at least from this distance, seems to be going on this year with the federal ARPA money or American Rescue Plan Act, and where that money is all going to be going to. So why don't I sort of be quiet for a minute, and I'll let you kind of fill us in on where the state budget is at and what are the next steps we can expect.
Okay, so the House passed its version of the budget in March. So the Senate Appropriations Committee, which includes Senator Dick Sears of Bennington County, has had that since then. They spent all of last week focused on the budget. They're actually meeting about that today, the day this is being filmed, and it's expected that that's going to pass out of the Appropriations Committee to the Senate floor this week, the week this is being filmed. So yet to see exactly what the slight differences might be. I think the big consideration for both the House and Senate versions and the way that they're putting things forward and the way the governor sees things is how much of that American Rescue Plan Act or ARPA money is going to be spent this year, and how much of it's going to be sort of put forward towards longer term projects. The House took the position that they would take some of that money and they would use it to backfill general fund needs instead, which allowed them to do some other different things. For example, putting aside $150 million for the state's ginormous unfunded pension liability, and also putting aside some money to make sure that the reinvention of the Vermont State Colleges system is able to move forward. That's a very high priority for both the House and the Senate. Governor sees things a little differently with the ARPA money. There are a lot of common interests with what the two sides want to spend that money on. Broadband, that's easy. Clean water action on making sure that we're funding our clean water agreement projects, that's also pretty easy. But there's the governor has a different. He's got more project oriented agenda that he'd like to see laid out in legislation. I think he'd also like to see it more, the accounting of that money be a little more transparent than sort of piecemeal throughout the budget. And so I think there's agreement to be reached there, but I think it sort of depends on, I know he's shown us before that he's more than willing to veto bills and budgets he doesn't like. So I guess that's where we're sort of in the wait and see mode on that, because first we have to get through the House and Senate differences. And my indication so far is there aren't that many differences. And then we have to figure out, okay, well, what does Governor Scott think about this, and are we going to have a veto session? So that's the longer answer to the short question.
So the budget has passed the House, but is waiting action in the Senate. That's
It's in the
basically.
Senate Appropriations Committee as we speak on this Monday, April 26th. I had to look down and check. Was told it was actually they were hoping to get that out today. So so by the time this airs, it might be, long. It might, you have to run pretty quick to catch that train. So yes, so things have changed by the time you're watching this.
Right.
So, at that point, we'll see where we are.
All right. Well, the other bill that received some attention last week, kind of caught my interest and confused me a little bit as well, I guess, was this business around H or House 315, which I guess was a sort of a ARPA, or rather a COVID relief measure that the House and Senate passed, that the governor allowed to become law without his signature, and he sent a very long explanation about that. Usually these are, at least the ones I've read anyway, seem to be fairly short and terse. This one went on for a little bit about how he kind of was concerned about the way the legislature was using the ARPA money, that rather than keeping it separate and using it in one bill, where all that money would be going towards targeted projects like broadband or childcare or whatever it is we feel we need to address that we haven't been able to do because we haven't had the money, and now we have this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, whereas the legislature seems to be spending it piecemeal. Is that what's going on?
Well, that's kind of what's going on, yes. First of all, H315 is just one of those bills. Some of them, in my short term doing this, will be a year in June. You realize that some bills they just kind of take on a life of their own. And H315, as you might recall, started because the House did not put the $10 million that the governor wanted into the Budget Readjustment Act. And so they were going to construct a bill in Commerce and Community Development that was going to very quickly get that $10 million for businesses that had not previously qualified for CARES Act funds. And then, move that quickly. And that was in February or March. 2 months later, that bill is about 10 times the size. It grew to nearly $100 million. And so, and there's a lot of different need and different programs that were sort of attached to that, because in a short session, lawmakers are looking for a vehicle, essentially, a bill they know is going to pass. And so that's what the ornaments how the ornaments get put on the Christmas tree, metaphorically speaking. So I think there might have been some frustration with the way that grew. Second of all, it does kind of speak to the different way of doing things from the governor's perspective and from the House and the Senate's perspective. The sense I get from talking to leadership is like, look, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and there's still a lot of need out there, and there's the money that we need to spend, and we need to spend it quickly. I think the governor doesn't totally disagree with that, but he's looking at sort of more of a long-term, a little more of a long-term perspective, not in the sense that the money doesn't need to be spent now, but because some of the money he actually does want to spend rather quickly. But in terms of, let's say you won the lottery, and do you spend the money on, do you buy yourself a farm and a couple of llamas, or do you put some money down in an annuity or build something that is going to last a couple generations? And I think he's, not at these aren't at the exclusion of each other. I think there's a pretty broad agreement that there's needs that can be addressed with this money. But it's just sort of a different way of doing things. And also, it's politics. The House and the Senate do they're the legislative branch, and as such, they have control of the purse string. But the governor won his reelection race by a good 40 points and feels he has a mandate, and he is the executive branch. So there's that natural tension between I don't think. Well, I don't know if I want to say what I think, because that usually means that the opposite's about to happen. And I don't know if anyone wants a veto session, but when you sort of look back at it longitudinally, the legislature's really been pretty much going full steam since last March, and I do think that there's a little fatigue, which is natural. I think we're all a little fatigued having lived through this situation. So that's sort of where that sits. But in terms of the governor allowing 315 to become law without his signature, well, there was too much in that bill that was too important to veto it. There was simply, I don't think, which again sort of points to sort of broader agreement.
Right. Which highlights the whole the interesting numbers game that's going on, particularly in the House of Representatives, where last fall Republicans did pick up a couple of seats, and the Democrats lost the theoretical veto-proof majority between them and the progressives. They couldn't, if they all remained united, they couldn't override it just on those two. So creates a slightly.
That's proven more theoretical than I expected, by the way. The progressives and the Democrats, they have a lot in common, but there are a number of occasions where they agree to disagree.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting where you sort of have multiple points of view coming from multiple sides, but there's still this sort of larger core, in the middle that sort of winds up being the majority on a lot of issues. It's fascinating stuff. Yeah. I mean, at least I find it interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
So I hope that comes through.
Well, let's move on to the whole question around the pensions, the state pensions that were a huge topic of conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure it still is. And many folks will remember the whole discussion around the fact that the state has a roughly $5.6 or $5.7 billion long-term pension obligation to teachers and state employees. That figure has ballooned enormously from the 1990s or so, when the evil seed, if they want to look at it that way, was planted. And I guess it seemed like the state legislature came up with a plan to have the teachers and the state workers kind of pay a little bit more into it and maybe lose a few benefits. Uproar followed. They backed off. It's probably too cynical to say, well, the can got kicked down the road, but that's sure it's what a study committee sounds like. So right now we're going to have a study committee, I guess, over the summer to look at this again. But is that kind of the end of it, or is that still a conversation topic?
We're just getting started. So where we are right now is the bill that set forth the expansion of the investment committee that actually handles the pension investments. And so this bill did two things. It did that, and it also established the membership of the task force and its charge. That has passed the House fairly convincingly. That's on its way now to the Senate Government Operations Committee. And so what I'm going to be looking for is whether the Senate makes any changes, notably changes in the representation, because the employee unions felt that there was not enough direct employee representation in those two entities. And that all really comes down to whether you see the legislature as management or not, finger quotes. And there's differences of opinion on that, and they're honest differences of opinion. So whether the Senate makes a change in that direction or makes changes in the structure of how they want VPIC, which is that pension committee, to move forward, that'll be interesting to see, because that'll probably lead us to disagreement between the House and the Senate, and possibly a conference committee. So there's that aspect of it. There's also another budgetary question that's sort of hearkening back to 315 into the budget. What the House did was it found $150 million that it wanted to kick in to start paying down some of that unfunded liability. And to be clear, that unfunded liability is about $3 billion in pension liability, and another $2.6 billion in healthcare and other assorted post-employment benefits. They're sort of part of the same larger pot, because in what universe would you not pay for retiree healthcare? But at the same time, they do need to sort of be accounted differently. Just it's a fine point, but an important one. So the governor doesn't want to spend that $150 million on the unfunded liability until there's structural reform that happens. And so there might be a question about how much of that is is sort of put in a fund for when that happens, or does it get spent, or should it get spent now? So that's one of the questions that has to be answered by the Senate Appropriations Committee as they work on the budget as we speak. So Getting back to sort of the larger pension questions, it's never a fun day when members of the legislature have to risk angering one of their core constituencies, which is organized labor. But when you think about it, what the budget proposes to spend on the annual contribution this year, $316 million. That's more than the entire budget of the Department of Health. That's a giant number. So when you're thinking about those increasing annual contributions, not only is that money that you're spending, but it's also money that you can't spend on other things you need. And if that keeps growing at the pace it's been growing the past couple of years, then that really becomes that really gets dangerous for the states. For the bond rating, for the pension funds themselves. Nobody in the legislature wants to see these things fail, because there's a long-term cost to that. The worse off retirees are, the more they need state assistance, and so that sort of becomes sort of a vicious circle. So right now that's where we are. We're in the Senate with that bill. As far as the task force, we're going to have to wait and see what the two sides agree to on the constitution of it. But I think there is. It would be easy to be cynical about it and say, well, we kicked the can, but it was a very aggressive lift from the start to think that there was a possibility of pushing through changes this massive by the end of this legislative session. And they want to adjourn in mid-May. So that timetable was really aspirational. And so I don't think there's going to be a lack of will. I think where things are going to be interesting is what the task force comes back with, because the legislature has to sign off on whatever the task force comes back with, and there's nothing that says the legislature has to go along with everything they say. So I think a lot of the same arguments will wind up being repeated, and we'll continue to see a lot of the same pressures about sort of the need for the state to be fiscally responsible and the need for the state to honor its commitment to its employees. This and of course the byproduct of this being task forced, if you will, is that all that's going to happen in an election year.
Right.
So
I'm sure that's what they would have liked.
Curiouser. It's important. It seems kind of wonky because you start throwing around pension acronyms like ADAC and OPEB. It's just, you can feel your eyes starting to glaze over. But as wonky as it is, it's also really important because of the there's like ginormous sums of money we're talking about.
And this is money that ARPA funds could be used for, or...
Well, no, this is not money ARPA funds can be used for. And that's where the juggling comes in. Because if we use the ARPA funds to backfill the general fund, then that frees up general fund money that we can put into the pension. So, but we also, next year, the federal government's going to stop writing Vermont multi-billion-dollar checks. I think we've seen the last one in terms of COVID relief. So what we have to prepare for is a universe in which we don't have this money to play with, and we've got to make do the way we did before. So these choices have to get made now, and I think that's what's going to see this task force's recommendations through to action actually happening at the start of the next session, because there is no tomorrow on this one.
Right. Well, let's pivot over to the education side of things. Always another fascinating source of
another wonky topic. Yes.
Discussion. You wrote a really interesting article last week that appeared in the Banner. I guess it was in the weekend edition of the Banner about per pupil weighting, and that's, I guess, deals with there are some students who are maybe not English is not their primary language, or they come from a poverty background, or one way or another cost more to educate than some other students do. Mm-hmm. So I guess over the years, that's developed a situation where some towns get a bit of a tax benefit from that, and other towns don't. And I guess is the legislature attempting to try and bring some uniformity to that, or what's going on?
Well, if you thought pensions were complicated, let's get into the Vermont school education finance. You're going to really make your eyes glaze over. So I'll try to simplify this as much as I can, because I'm still learning stuff, and they pay me to do this. So the way Vermont tries to address equity in funding is by counting some students more heavily than others, because with the understanding that it does cost more to educate students who come with needing to learn English as a new language, students who are coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Also that it costs a little more to educate middle school and high school students, just period. And also what's included in this formula that's being presented is the additional cost of rural districts. And then that's sort of central to Southern Vermont in a lot of ways. So the legislature asked the University of Vermont to conduct a study of these weights in 2018 when it passed Act 173, the Special Education Block Grant Bill. That study came back in 2019, and it said, the weights you've been using, we can't find any empirical evidence on what they were based upon. So here's our work, and here are the weights that we can have, that we should use. And so the question is, how do we implement those weights? And there were two approaches put forward in the House, and one in the House, one in the Senate. The House said, let's put them in, let's phase them in over time, over a couple of years. Let's temporarily pause the overspending penalty, and we'll do it that way. The Senate said, let's have an implementation task force, because this is really complicated. And this is where things get really political. Because some districts have been massively underweighted, their property taxes are going to go down. Because the more students you have, the lower your tax rate. Because some districts have over time been overweighted, their property taxes could possibly go up. And so that's anytime we're talking about taxes and education funding, I mean, those two things on their own, I think this was the lead. Those two things all by themselves would be complicated and really political hot potatoes. You put those two things together, and you start talking about equity and start talking about the impact on districts and on property taxes, then that's just dancing on the third rail all the way to town. So right now we're in the middle of in the House, trying to figure out. The Senate passed its version of the bill. That's Senator Brian Campion of Bennington's committee, the Education Committee, and they went with the implementation study. So the House is taking up that version of it. Right now it's in the House Education Committee, which includes Kathleen James of Manchester. Once they are finished with their work, it will go to the Ways and Means Committee, which includes Emily Kornheiser of Brattleboro and David Durfee of Shaftesbury. And so where the tension seems to come in is that you can already see some questions about the weights and about how this is phased in and about sort of the initial cost, and also sort of alternative theories to this really significant property tax shock. Well, what if we just took categorical aid? What if we just gave the districts aid that would bridge the gap between where they should have been and where they are? And so there's a whole sort of argument about, well, does that really, I mean, that provides funding equity, yes, but is that enshrined in law in such a way that it's predictable and that it can't be changed? If there's a recession and suddenly we have to cut back on education grants, then where are we? If you do that, these weights would guarantee that we would have the proper funding formula for funding our schools. So that's just one really big political hot potato, and it's and again, we're talking about a task force, but it was very carefully worded to be an implementation task force. So this is yet another situation where the legislature will come back in January and have a really big issue on its hands. So the place to be is going to be, I'm hoping that we're back in person and by January, because I would like to actually be able to watch those debates in person rather than over Zoom. It's going to be very important. And where we're sitting here in Southern Vermont, just across between community to community, the impacts are not uniform. I mean, some towns might see their taxes go up, some towns might see their taxes go down. And there's also questions about how this plays into special education funding. There's also questions about whether, maybe at the same time we should completely change the funding formula altogether. Let's forget about property taxes. Let's move to a strictly income tax-based system because that's fairer. Mm-hmm. Maybe that makes sense, but you just added a pretty an additional heavy lift to what was already a very heavy lift bill.
Right.
I hope I haven't lost all our viewers by now talking about education funding for the last 5 minutes.
Oh, I
But
well, I think
it's important stuff,
Yeah,
and it's a very much a pocketbook issue.
Yeah.
It's an education equity issue. So it's and it's uniquely Vermont. They brought in experts to talk about this and said, well, how would you compare this to what other states do? And the experts say, no other state does it like the way you do it. So this is one that we've got to try to figure out how to solve ourselves.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left. I just was wondering, just to kind of wind it up, anything in particular you're looking to follow closely in the next couple of weeks? I mean, we've talked about a couple of issues here between pensions and the waiting and the budget and everything. But is there some bill or two that you're kind of that maybe has a Southern Vermont focus?
Well, there's a couple things. Being one reporter trying to cover the operations of a state, even a state as small as Vermont, is there's stuff that I've wanted to get to that I haven't quite gotten to yet, and actually had a conversation this morning about the Better Places bill, which became sort of an economic development omnibus bill. I'd like to dig a little more into that, and I guess by saying that on television, I just committed myself to writing that story. So this is a dangerous little exercise you've cooked up for me, Andrew.
Sorry.
Let's see what else. There's also corrections. There's concerns about, there's a corrections reform bill. There's lots of representation on the corrections commission, the committee, House Corrections Committee from Southern Vermont. And so, haven't been able to get to that as much as I'd like. I'd like to dig into that a little more. There's also just over this past week, and I think the third reading of it's coming up this week, is the redo of the literacy bill. So that's both the Senate and the House were working on ways to try to improve literacy in K through 12 education. And they had to sort of go back and redo their work because all this additional federal funds came in. And so they've finally passed that sort of rejiggered version of that. Also, the House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee, which is that's Seth Bongartz and Nelson Brownell of Manchester and Pownell, respectively. They're taking a look at some Act 250 possible. They're taking another look at Act 250, and that only got so far last year. They passed a narrowed down bill, sort of whittled down a sort of more narrowly focused bill that the governor vetoed. So they're taking another run at that. That's probably something else that goes till next year. And there's the bottle bill. Which is also passed the House. The Senate is going to let that one percolate for a while.
Right.
So, because the House chose not to double they chose not to follow through in the proposal to double the deposit to 10 cents. But it does expand it to water bottles and to sports drink bottles and wine bottles. So, and there was a lot of political pushback on that. That was a closer vote than I expected. So, so there's no shortage of things for me to do, which is good, which means I get to keep writing for a living.
Right. Well,
so,
better optimistic note. We'll have to leave it there for today. Boy, there's certainly a lot more we could talk about for sure if we had a little more time, but we'll have to leave it there for now. But obviously, we'll need to have you back on after the session closes.
I'd love that.
Tell us how it all turned out. But and then for now, we'll just have to kind of keep reading your stories. Anyway, thanks again, Greg Sukiennik, for being with us today. He writes for the Banner, the Journal, and the Reformer, covering the Vermont State House. And thanks to all of you for being with us as well. Glad to have you along, and hope you enjoyed the program. And we'll see you again the next time.